Most young people are so busy getting on with their lives that they seldom keep a record of how they live. But the prisoners in Stobs were different. They had time on their hands, and so the newspaper gives us an insight into what sort of people they were and how they coped with captivity. In the early years of the 20th century, a military training camp was established at Stobs near Hawick in the Scottish borders. It was situated 1.5 miles from Stobs railway station on the Waverley route. After the outbreak of the First World War, an internment camp for nationals of the Central Powers was quickly constructed there. It opened on the 2nd of November 1914 and remained in use until 1919. Most of the prisoners were German. All were men. The camp consisted of 4 compounds, each of which contained 10 large accommodation huts. For reasons of security, the British government had chosen to intern many of the German nationals who were living in the country at the outbreak of the war, and a number of these were accommodated in one of the compounds in Stobs. It was the civilian prisoners who established the newspaper in 1915. It was sold both in the camp and in Germany. Understandably, it was subject to censorship, and was no doubt intended to convey the impression that being imprisoned might be preferable to enduring hardship and danger on the front line. But nonetheless, it yields a good picture of how people lived and coped with their years of internment. The people in Stobs had led different lives before they came there. Some of them were school teachers, some were farm workers, and some of them were members of the German armed forces. What many of them had in common was the liking for beer. But it was in short supply in Stobs Camp. If you look at the beer bottle here, it tells you something about the company. It's based in Tsingtao on the coast of mainland China, and it was established in 1903, but not because the Chinese had developed a taste for beer, even if this beer is now often chosen in Chinese restaurants. It was established because this was the age of empires, and Tsingtao was a German colony and naval base. No doubt the sailors liked to drink beer too. When the First World War started, the German squadron was out in the Pacific on a training exercise. The presence of HMAS Australia, a modern battle cruiser, caused the German admiral Graf Spee to take his ships eastwards towards the coast of Chile. Here is a picture of SMS Scharnhorst, which, together with her sister ship SMS Gneisenau and 3 light cruisers, constituted the fighting power of the squadron. Off the coast of Chile, near the town of Coronel, on the 1st of November, the squadron encountered a British squadron of roughly equivalent size. This is a picture of HMS Good Hope, as in Cape of Good Hope, which, together with HMS Monmouth, constituted the main fighting power of the British squadron. The German ships' guns had a greater range, and their gunners were highly trained, whereas the crews on the British ships were mainly reservists with less experience. In the unequal battle, the German ships were able to bombard the British ships from a safe distance. HMS Good Hope blew up, and HMS Monmouth was sunk by shell fire, resulting in a humiliating defeat for the Royal Navy and the loss of about 1,600 British lives. There were no significant German casualties. This was the first time since the Napoleonic Wars that the Royal Navy had suffered such a significant defeat. The Navy's response was swift. 2 modern battle cruisers, the sister ships HMS Invincible and HMS Inflexible, were dispatched to the Falkland Islands together with a number of cruisers. Von Spee's squadron, which was heading back into the Atlantic, was apparently lured there by a fake signal sent in German naval code, and in the ensuing battle, most of his ships were sunk, with a loss of about 2,000 German lives. However, there were about 217 survivors, mostly from SMS Gneisenau. Here you can see some of the sailors in the water awaiting rescue. The temperature was only 5 degrees centigrade, so not all survived. But those who did were sent to Stobs. They would soon be joined by survivors from the sinking of the Blücher on the 13th of January 1915. While the civilian prisoners' experiences were sometimes more prosaic, they were quite harrowing in their own way and well expressed in verse in the Stobsiade. Here is an example. I should explain that in order to convey the meaning of the translated poems, it has sometimes been necessary to omit any attempt to make them rhyme. Occasionally the German-English words are similar, as in the case of lamb and tram in this translation. The significance of the poem is that Mr. Müller was a low-grade military reservist. Given that conscription was mandatory in Germany, it didn't mean very much, and the idea that he would be carrying a gun was laughable. I'll read it to you now. It was exactly a year ago, it happened in Tottenham Road, that a police inspector brought Fritz Müller into ghastly trouble. Fritz Müller was a hairdresser and barber, was as peaceful as a lamb, and yet the superintendent from the station went personally to him in the tram. I am, Mr. Müller, very sorry for you. You will, you know, be interned. But do not be afraid, you see, that anything will happen to you now. I'll give you time till 10 o'clock, so pack your things quickly. I'm really very sorry, Mr. Müller, but it cannot be any different. And now, Mr. Müller, I ask you please, were you a soldier or not? What is your relationship to the military? To ask you is my duty. Fritz handed over his passport. I am and I was an armed third-line soldier, dear sir. And nervously the superintendent slipped out with, Man, hand over your weapon. The comic effect is enhanced in the German text by mixing German and English. Listen carefully for English as I read the poem in German. Es war gerade vor einem Jahr die Szene in Tottenham Road. Da brachte ein Polizeikommissar Fritz Müller in grässliche Not. Fritz Müller war Friseur und Barbier, war friedfertig wie ein Lamm, und doch fuhr der Kommissar vom Revier höchst selber zu ihm in der Tram. I am Mr. Müller, sehr traurig für Sie. Sie werden, you know, interniert. Doch haben Sie keine Befürchtung, you see, dass Ihnen jetzt etwas passiert. Ich gebe Ihnen jetzt bis 10 Uhr Zeit, so packen Sie quick alles ein. Es tut mir, Mr. Müller, mir wirklich sehr leid, doch kann es nicht anders sein. And now, Mr. Müller, ich bitte sehr, waren Sie auch Soldat oder nicht? Was ist Ihr Verhältnis zum Militär? To ask you ist meine Pflicht. Fritz reichte den Pass. Ich bin und ich war Landsturm mit Waffe, dear Sir. Und nervös entfuhr es dem Kommissar. Mann, geben Sie die Waffe her. Here is a picture of some of the civilian prisoners. Some of them are obviously quite old. Was it really necessary to lock up people like that? I find that although they may not be great poetry, the poems in the Stobsiade convey the circumstances that they experienced very directly. The British blockade of Central Power's shipping resulted in the internment of their officers and crew. In this excerpt from a poem, a captain bemoans his fate. I was the master of everything. I was the captain. I led the crew a merry dance, for I was sovereign. I led the crew's government as an absolute ruler. No parliament and no upper house were there to bother me. Wherever I went within the ship, if I appeared, they raised the alarm with an officer or an engineer or anybody else on board the ship. Now I sit here in the camp, marooned like in a dry dock. I'm getting thin and haggard and my uniform is getting shabby. Navigation is over, on the sea and on my territory. No need to set the compass, no rum or punch or beer. I don't travel about any more on my free blue sea. Now, which I mention by the by, I'm only a hut captain. There were undoubtedly injustices committed in the course of the blockade. People travelling back to the USA from mainland Europe, who were obviously not intending to join the forces of the Central Powers, were interned. One of the doctors in Stobs was originally travelling to Europe to volunteer for frontline service with the German forces. There was no way that he could escape from Stobs, and he eventually committed suicide by taking an opiate overdose. Some of the civilian internees had lived in England for a long time. They were interned solely on the basis of their nationality. One of these, Karl Karle, a butcher from Hohenlohe in Germany, who migrated to Manchester in 1900, was initially interned in Lancaster. In December 1914, he was released only to be interned again in Stobs after the sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915. He spent the rest of the war in internment, travelling with the rest of the civilian prisoners from Stobs to Nokelo in July 1916. Fortunately, Karl kept a diary. You can see it here. Very thin writing, very dense text, but it gives us an understanding of someone who had obviously settled quite happily in Britain, became progressively alienated as a result of the treatment by the authorities. We also learn from his diary about things in Stobs which never reached the columns of this newspaper. For example, the prisoners believed that the Battle of Jutland was a German victory, and were also very pleased to learn of the death of General Kitchener. Karl's account of his time in Nokelo as the war comes to an end gives us a useful insight into the conflicting attitudes of the prisoners as they attempt to make sense of what was happening from British newspapers. What was life like for the prisoners in Stobs? This picture of a work of marquetry depicting the camp is revealing in a number of ways. The skill involved in making the picture is illustrative of the way that some prisoners used their time constructively. In addition to marquetry, they carved bones, and the sailors made ship models. The development of craft skills was actively encouraged in the camp and supported by the Society of Friends, the Quakers, who provided a hut in which people could work, and arranged for the sale of works in neutral countries, though some of them were also sold locally. This picture illustrates various features of the life in Stobs. There's a distant view of attractive hilly countryside, but we can also see the barbed wire fence down at the bottom of the hill. The presence of duckboards and steps up to the huts is indicative of the clay soil which is so vividly and frequently deplored in the newspaper. The presence of the chimney illustrates the location of the stove, which was both a source of heat and a place where people could cook for themselves. The stove was a place where people would congregate, whereas places near the door were subject to the vagaries of the weather. This picture shows an example of the careful and intricate artistic work which some of the bone carvers could achieve. This one was carved by a pork butcher, Christian Dietz, from Liverpool. The bones used in the carving came from the kitchen. Some people found the smell of cooking offensive, as can be seen from this poem. Lots of people complain, "Oh, how bad the air is in our hut. There's a constant stink of onions and of fat and a smell of frying. Why, I ask, is the top of the stove flat and not curved? That is quite outrageous, I say. That is unhealthy. For people simmer things till 10 in the evening on the flat lid of the stove. If you say something, they just say, 'Go outside, I'm busy frying.' And so they fry and simmer, partly in oil and partly in fat, till you lose all interest and sink down on your bed. Hardly has the morning's weak spark glowed in the stove's round stomach, when a pan of murky gravy lands on it and smells too. Fried potatoes, bacon and sausage, eggs, onions, glue and tea, and you hear the hissing and bubbling and you say, 'Oh no,' and you say, 'Oh no, how bad the air is in our hut. There's a constant stink of onions and of fat and the smell of frying. Why, I ask, is the top of the stove flat and not curved? That is quite outrageous, I say. That is unhealthy.'" This poem was written by Willie Ohms, a teacher from Hereford in Westphalia. The Hoyk Museum has a collection of his correspondence, from which we learn that he coped quite well with being in the camp, even though he really missed his family. Among the subjects which he taught in the camp was calligraphy. This extract from an Ordnance Survey map illustrates the layout of the camp. Note the location of the railway and the light railway leading up from the station to the camp. On the 4th of February 1916, Mr. Edward Lowry of the US Embassy inspected the camp. The report started off with some useful statistics. Stobs housed a total of 4,616 prisoners, of whom 1,829 were soldiers, 504 were sailors, and 2,283 were civilians. This picture shows the interior of a hut which is probably used for study. If you look carefully, you'll notice the Christmas decorations near the roof. The furniture, as you can see, was fairly rudimentary, without upholstery, and probably quite uncomfortable. As you can see, living on a hillside in the Scottish borders did expose the inhabitants of the camp to the best of Scottish weather. Here we are, Monday, wintry rain showers, Tuesday, rainy wintry showers, Wednesday, showery winter rain, Thursday, wintry showers of rain, Friday, showery rainy winter, Saturday, rainy showery winter, Sunday, winter rain showers. This poem conveys the experience of sitting in a hut as the rain comes down. It's raining. On the roofs the water falls pitter-patter. We're sitting round about the stove and talk our chitter-chatter. At the side table, Friedrich is sawing intarsia fantasies. Sissy, sissy, sings the saw, which I lent to him. It's raining. Tip, tip, tap. The days will soon flow on by. And if they wake us tomorrow, it'll probably still be pouring. In his corner, Max soulfully plays the violin, while Heinrich Karl from Magdeburg files on an iron rail. It's raining. From afar sounds the loud call of the sentries. We're waiting, and the limitless time leaves us rusting here on the sidelines. In the summer, the weather was good enough for people to be able to participate in various sports, and sports days provided an opportunity for social contact. When civilians and military prisoners were both present, sports days were jointly organised. There were, however, tensions between the military and the civilian prisoners. Some of the civilian prisoners had been in Britain for a long time, some had British wives, and some could not identify with German patriotism. This seems to have infuriated some of the military prisoners, and may be the reason why the decision was made to strictly separate them from each other. Given the febrile atmosphere in the outside world, the camp commander, Major Bowman, must have been quite liberal in his approach, allowing a square in the military camp to be named after General Hindenburg, and permitting the prisoners to celebrate the Kaiser's birthday. In the winter, generally speaking, gymnastics took over from athletics, though football was played in both summer and winter, whenever the weather allowed. The hut which you can see in the background of this picture was provided by the American YMCA at the time before America became involved in the war. The large hut could also be used in providing entertainment and for religious services. In an era before there were radio broadcasts, all entertainment was live. Given the circumstances in Stobs, this meant that there was a need for both theatre and music. Fortunately, there were a number of trained musicians among the prisoners, and theatrical skills were gradually developed. In the case of theatre, related skills, such as the construction of props and the tailoring of appropriate costumes, also had to be developed. In the absence of women, men had to take on all the female roles. By 1916, the drama club of the civilian camp was performing a 4-act play, complete with stage sets and costumes. The cast consisted of 7 male and 4 female roles. It is interesting to note that the plays selected for these performances are not the ones now represented as typical of the era. Here is an extract of a description of a concert by the music critic of the Stobsiade. Our musical life has recently experienced a very fortunate upturn. On the 26th of July, Staff Sergeant Bachenheimer, a professional concert singer, gave us the first example of his ability. The string orchestra, capably conducted by Rifleman Ruges, performed Mendelssohn's Eternally Young and Jubilant Wedding March and the overture Fingal's Cave. The singer possesses an exceptionally powerful baritone voice, combined with a very clear diction. The chosen piece of music featured both qualities to his advantage. All in all, the evening was a real pleasure. How strange it seems to think of these Germans listening to music composed by their compatriot Mendelssohn on his visit to Scotland more than 80 years before. So near and yet so far. This is the first mention of Herr Bachenheimer, but he is frequently mentioned in subsequent issues of the newspaper, and he was greatly appreciated. As well as musical and theatrical performances, the Gymnastics Club organised entertainment evenings, combining gymnastic performances with musical entertainment. These three people were actively involved in providing assistance from the outside. Robert Clark and James Bailey belonged to the Society of Friends and frequently visited the camp. Robert Clark was an Englishman who had returned to Britain from California before the outbreak of war. Unable to return, he remained till the end of the war and provided pastoral support to the prisoners. James Bailey was responsible for matters relating to the workshop previously mentioned. Dr. Markle was a retired industrialist of German origin who provided all kinds of practical and financial support. In 1915, the civilian camp held an exhibition displaying creative works, and this became a regular feature of camp life, held at least once a year. No account of life in the camp would be complete without dealing with the school. Given that the German army included many conscripts, it was only natural that some of them would be school teachers from all across the country. The slide that you see here is a representation of how the school saw itself, as a provider of knowledge which would enable the prisoner to see beyond the barbed wire. Many of the prisoners had only had a limited education. The school offered courses for people to refresh their knowledge and build on it. It provided adult education on an ambitious scale, and the teachers also continued their own further education. In 1917, the school also became involved in the annual exhibitions. This extract from a list of the subjects taught is taken from the Stobsiade for January 1917. The complete list is 4 pages long. The extract illustrates how the school catered for people with very different backgrounds and levels of attainment. The following pages cover subjects such as mathematics, science and technology, shorthand, agriculture, business and commerce. After the civilian prisoners left for the Isle of Man, the military prisoners decided to re-establish the newspaper. This picture shows the first military edition. In order to distinguish this new start, it was numbered 1-15, so it was actually the 15th in the original numbering scheme. In starting the new edition, the editors emphasised that the paper should provide people back home in Germany with a picture of life in the camp. It should also help to motivate people, and it should provide a record of what had been achieved. I'm going to read this next poem in German, but I'd like you to read along in English so that you can get both a sense of the way it rhymes in German, the way it sounds in German, and at the same time have a translation so you can make sense of it. So it's schlaflos. Schlaflos lieg ich all die Stunden, horche in die Nacht hinaus. Meine Seele rastlos wandert, über Berg und Meer nach Haus. Meine Kameraden atmen, heiß und schwer im engen Raum. Mancher ächzt und sieht sich wieder, zwischen Schlacht und Tod im Traum. Fährt mit einem Schrei vom Lager, will noch fassen ans Gewehr. Und starrt mit wirren Augen auf die Schläfer ihn her. Rings ums Lagerposten rufen, einer laut den anderen an. Schlaflos lieg ich, müden Herzens, das nicht Ruhe finden kann. Höre, wie im Tal die Züge rollen durch die Frühlingsnacht, wie im Baum mit zartem Liede eine Amsel früh erwacht. One thing one will not find in the Stobsiade is any mention of escapes, but they did occur. This was probably the most daring, and it nearly succeeded. The 6 men, 2 of whom had been in the crew of a Zeppelin, escaped on the night of the 23rd to the 24th of August, somehow made their way to Scarborough, took a small boat, and were eventually captured 170 miles from land. This extract from a report by a Swiss delegation who inspected Stobs illustrates the nature of the diet. While adequate, it couldn't be described as interesting. Those who could afford it were able to augment their diets by purchasing food from the canteen. There was also another way of augmenting diets, which involved some effort: gardening. The prisoners found that radishes flourished on the Stobs hillside. Having succeeded with the local variety, they obtained seeds for the kind of radishes which are popular in the beer cellars of Munich. Thanks to the generosity of a Quaker lady, the prisoners were also able to grow a wide range of flowers round the huts. Sometimes their efforts were disturbed by the wild rabbits which ran around the hillside. The crows, some of which had been adopted as pets, also made themselves unpopular in this way. The camp had its own hospital. This extract from the picture shown previously shows where it was located. The hospital was a frequent recipient of charitable donations from within the camp. There is practically no other mention in the newspaper of the arrival of wounded soldiers in the camp, but an article about the hospital mentions how war invalids were taught how to write with their left hands. The hospital was run by a British doctor. 2 German doctors and a dentist who were prisoners of war reported to him. Volunteers from the camp took particular care to maintain the environment round the hospital, and the camp orchestra played there once a week. The September 1917 edition of the Stobsiade is devoted to religious life in the camp and to the topic of death in captivity. This slide shows the funeral of one of the inmates. The editorial tries to convey the idea that death at the front is preferable to death in captivity. The newspaper also has a description of the camp cemetery and how it was established by the prisoners. As you can see from the picture, it was carefully constructed and maintained. The memorial in the centre carried the text, "For our comrades who died far from home." Work camps meant a rather startling change of scenery. The first mention of work camps comes in the Stobsiade for April 1917. As a result of a change of government policy, men from Stobs were sent to work in camps throughout of Scotland and elsewhere. Although it was in breach of the Geneva Convention, much of the work actually contributed to the British war effort. The picture shows a view of present-day Kinlochleven, which is home to an aluminium smelter powered by hydroelectricity. The prisoners were occupied in constructing large pipes to lead more water into the reservoir, and were housed in a camp of similar construction to the one in Stobs, located between the dam and the village. In the August 1917 edition of the Stobsiade, there is a fairly positive account of a day in Kinlochleven. In some ways, this activity, working, was preferable to being idle in Stobs. This extract from the July 1917 edition of the Stobsiade is very useful in telling us about the work camps, since the sums of money provided related to the number of people in the camps. Thus we can conclude that there were only 2 large camps, Kinlochleven with 900 prisoners and Dalmellington in Ayrshire with 1,400. The work which was carried out in Dalmellington was intended to provide a facility for training air gunners, but it was eventually abandoned and the prisoners were returned to Stobs. The newspaper contains several accounts of journeys to work camps. The brief glimpse which the prisoners had of people leading relatively normal lives and the travel involved had a big impact on the prisoners. The policy of prisoner exchange had a big impact on life in Stobs. During the First World War, both Switzerland and the Netherlands remained neutral. In 1916, Britain and Germany agreed that certain prisoners in poor health could be transferred to Switzerland to await the end of the war. The respective governments had to pay for the accommodation provided. The agreement was later extended to allow prisoners to be transferred to the Netherlands. The arrangement was supervised by Swiss doctors. Needless to say, exchange had a disruptive effect on camp life. Some internees set their hopes on leaving, only to be disappointed, while others, who played an active role in the life of the camp, departed at a time when they were most needed. The prisoners who were selected by the doctors in the camp were sent to other camps in England, where a further selection process took place. If they were unlucky, they might even end up back in Stobs. I'll read this poem to you now. I've tried my luck 3 times already, with the Swiss doctor a year ago. In vain, devoid of any hope, I remained back here with the others. Like a bird which can't fly and is locked up in a narrow cage, idles his life away, full of grief. A constant melancholy weakens us. Would we ever find once again the way to the safe lap of freedom, the way to a better lot? Almost all hope seemed to waste away. Then, after a long, anxious time, the sun of freedom's first ray reached us in our bleak Stobs Valley, renewing our will to live. The old ones in a better land, the new newspaper tells us. Enthusiastically the word goes round. The news comes quite unexpectedly. Let it be Holland or Switzerland. For us old Stobser it doesn't matter. If only we have the channel between us, then existence will have a meaning once again. Given the disruptive effect of prisoner exchange, 1918 started off much the same as previous years. The annual exhibition was delayed until the 20th of June, but in all, 375 works were displayed. In the April edition of the newspaper, there were articles about the school and about the clubs in the camp. However, the edition which should have appeared in August wasn't published, and by the time that the December edition was published, it was clear to the prisoners that although the war had come to an end with the armistice on the 5th of November, they would not be released until a peace treaty was signed. This poem, which is called Farewell, from the final decision of the newspaper for January to February 1919, shows some of the uncertainty that still existed about when people would return home. Let me read out the start of the poem in German. Endlich hat es doch gegolten, und man sagt's an allen Orten, Stobs is finished. Zwar so mancher zweifelt, ob's auch richtig sei. People were longing for the one short sentence, Stobs is finished. And the rest of the poem tells how individuals were guessing when they might be able to return home, and how joyful they would be when the day arrived and they could bid farewell to Stobs forever. It seems that it took even longer than expected to return home. Here is a postcard from one of the Stobs inhabitants, dated November 1919, describing his journey across the North Sea in a German freighter, which was not without incident. The weather was very rough, and many suffered from seasickness. Apparently the ship strayed into a minefield which had not yet been cleared, but it managed to extricate itself without any harm. On arrival in Brunsbüttel they were taken to a barracks. On the following day there was an official reception, and on the day after that they boarded trains taking them home. Even at the penultimate stage of their journey, they had been lucky to survive. These 2 websites provide more information about Stobs Camp. The first one is devoted to the newspaper. It also includes Carl Carla's diary. The second website provides a history of Stobs Camp, from before the First World War up to its eventual closure in the 1950s.